So this brings us to the second part of what we're going to talk about this week, democratizers. The malleability of political culture opens up space to cultivate democracy, to make room for it where it's historically been absent. And this might involve facilitating structures and institutions that are said to create democratic pressures. For example, speed up modernization in a country, or help to create strong schools and universities in a less developed country. It can also involve creating opportunities to skip those processes altogether, perhaps by just introducing or fomenting democratic norms and demands within society. For example, by supporting and growing non-governmental organizations or grassroots groups that are interested in more say in governance. In this section, we're going to talk about Western pressures for democratization. The US and other countries have been, at least intermittently, pressing for democratization for a good century now, at least when it's convenient. Wilson brought the U.S. into World War I, promising, quote, "the world must be safe for democracy." Another important note here is that the U.S. historically looked at democracy in a very mechanistic way. Under the Truman Doctrine, for example, Greece could only get aid, economic aid, if it had free institutions, representative government, if it promised freedom of speech, religion, and freedom from political repression. But what about, for instance, development of civil society in order to safeguard democracy? What about everything, again, in between those times when you go to the polls and vote? Okay. Also, U.S. policy has been really kind to non-Democrats that we need. One of the authors that you might have read is Whitehead, who comments, quote, "the rhetoric of democracy has frequently masked support for less appealing practices." The rhetoric of democracy has frequently masked support for less appealing practices. Where it's convenient, we've pushed and we continue to push. When I was a political economic officer in Uzbekistan in 2000, we pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed because we had no reason not to push. After 2001, after 9/11, we had a reason not to push. We needed Uzbekistan in our fight against Afghanistan. And so there we really quit pushing for a while. But then we went to a new war in Iraq, and what did we do? Well, we got to push Uzbekistan more. It looks good. If it's cheap and it looks good, we'll do it. If it comes with consequences, various geostrategic interests, and that may be economic, like oil, gas, it may be other strategic considerations like, hey, supporting our war, then we tend to back away. The U.S. is not alone in promoting democracy, although it does promote democracy in a very specific way. It tends to be much more outgoing. It tends to be much more blatant. It tends to be much more, oh, what's a good word? In your face. It's not a word, and it's probably not good. But it is much more in your face. It's about public chastising. Europeans tend to be much more oriented towards quiet democracy. But those promoting democracy as a whole tend to be stable, wealthy, and liberal capitalist states. So the U.S., Canada, Western Europe, Japan to a certain degree. Japan is a little quieter. And now we can, hey, welcome to the club, Poland, and other countries in Central Europe. Poland has been played a very important role in Ukraine and Belarus. But I suppose you could really call Poland at this point Western European, and all of Central Europe has moved almost to the point that, well, there's still economic differences, so I guess we don't want to go that far. But they're really part of the club in terms of promoting democracy. And in fact, if you look at the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, you had the most support within Europe coming from these Central European states that were sort of very ideological in the way they approached this. Doesn't mean they were very smart about approaching this in this sort of let's go to war way, as we've seen in retrospect. But they did approach this from the standpoint of democratization, perhaps even more than the U.S. did. So again, there's no room for smugness here. The U.S. is much more at ease with right-wing non-democrats, but Europeans are more at ease with left-wing authoritarians who stress social and economic participation. So all of us support non-democrats when it's convenient for us. And we all have historically made exceptions for non-democrats where it's convenient. Note, I think an important note here is the differing patterns of democratization among those who are pushing for democracy today. In the US and France, for example, democracy came through elite-led revolutions. And basically, they're about no taxation without representation, both of them. Okay? In the UK, we're talking about an evolved democratic process where groups of elites found it made sense over time to expand the universal franchise, to enfranchise people, to allow them participation within the state. In much of Western Europe, democracy came via conquest, especially after World War II, when the empires, the Austro-Hungarian Empire after World War I, went away. In much of the world, in Africa and Asia after World War II, when you had democracies that took root in many of the post-European colonies, and in Eastern Europe in the 1990s, the end of the 1980s, democracy came through these large people movements. They weren't about elites as we had before in the U.S., French, UK, and much of the Western European cases, post-imperial cases. So very different routes towards democracy, which may affect our democracy promotion agendas differently. A couple important general notes on these promoters to keep in the back of your mind. They've got their own histories of going both forward and backward, so it's not a linear process of moving from non-democracy to democracy. From the Magna Carta in Britain to the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon. You had the Magna Carta in Britain. The king gave a bunch of privileges to the nobility, and then he took some of them back. You had the French Revolution, and then you had the rise of Napoleon, who was clearly a non-democrat. Democratization sometimes takes 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Even where you had revolutions, you still had evolutions as well. So in France and the US, you had these revolutions for democracy, but if you look at what happens after these revolutions, it's not that, bam, everyone could go out and vote, everyone was treated equally. My white father drank from a different water fountain than his black peers, and that was only a handful of years ago. So you have this evolutionary process. You also have different understandings of democratic goals. The Europeans focus much more on social and economic participation. The US much more on political and electoral aspects of the process. And finally, we don't all share the same experience of democratization or the same goals of democratization, generally speaking. So, why do Western leaders pursue pro-democracy human rights agendas? And the answer is that there are lots of reasons. In some cases, one outweighing the others. So depending on the country, depending at the time, one country may pursue a pro-democracy agenda for different reasons. In the US, we like to talk about morality and the American character, which contributes to 2 things: the US image or self-image, as well as the US overseas PR image, what we want people to think of us as. And all these things go back to the notion of liberty. We want people to think within our country, we want to be representative of democracy and liberty. We want to be the foremost country in that domain. Same thing on the international circuit. We want to be known as the country that supports democracy and freedom. This provides for political and electoral advantage sometimes. Promoting democracy is great. It's a policy that reflects the genuine aspirations of the people within democratic countries, or at least the United States. It also expresses national self-satisfaction. We like what we are. We think everyone else should want to be that way. If you look at public opinion, that's what public opinion says. Public opinion wants to support a pro-democracy agenda, at least in the United States, to the degree that it's not sufficiently costly. And this brings us to the notion of domestic pressures. You've got Congress, which presses for pro-democracy policies. You've got lots of non-governmental organizations that press for pro-democracy pressures, that are pro-democracy pressures. You've got various constituents from other countries that live in the United States that want to press for democracy in their countries. So voters who do this. So domestic pressures. There are various strategic aspects. We can attack Iran. We can attack Iraq on human rights grounds. Right? Maybe it was about weapons of mass destruction. Maybe it was about oil, the war in Iraq. But we could call it about democracy as well. There are also tangible benefits. Technical assistance, advisory services pertaining to democracy and human rights. For example, all these things that the State Department spends its money on, about 80% of foreign aid is actually paid to U.S. companies. 95% of humanitarian aid is purchased at home. We don't go off and buy wheat from China and give it to Mongolia, even though it's much closer. We send our wheat all the way from American farmers to Mongolia, if we're giving wheat to Mongolia at this time. It means employment, an overall boost to the U.S. domestic economy. So there are lots of reasons that we want to pursue this. And then a big one is the democratic piece. The empirical finding that democracies rarely, if ever, go to war with one another. So the more democracies you have in the world, the more peaceful the world's going to be. We'll talk about this again in a couple minutes. Whatever the reasons, democracy promoters can justify their aims by pointing to an international community where democracy is the one acceptable system. There's a clearly evolving norm of democratic legitimacy on the international stage. Now, any discussion of democratic legitimacy has to begin with a definition. And so legitimacy merely refers to the acceptability of a government in the eyes of its people. This could be a function of public participation, like in a democracy, but it could just as easily be a function of policy outcome. Right? How the state is providing for its citizens. Off the bat, this suggests there's not necessarily any one legitimate form of government. You could have a king who provides better services, a very wealthy king who provides better services than a democracy, a very poor democracy, for example. So democracy is based on democracy itself is based on what we call rational legal legitimacy, the one up here, through a system of laws and procedures that are highly institutionalized. So people come to power through elections, and it's assumed that they'll serve the public interest, because it's in the interest of those they're going to serve the interest of those who elected me, because it's in my long-term interest to do that, so I get reelected. This is rational legal legitimacy. But democracy, and this notion of rational legal legitimacy, hasn't always been the legitimate system of choice. Not long ago, even the most undemocratic despots held a certain sort of legitimacy, which we call traditional legitimacy. The notion that these rulers have the right to rule because, well, that's the way it's always been. That's traditional legitimacy. The king should give the throne to the father, to the son, and pass it down the line. Now, sure, some of these kings and queens shared another form of legitimacy, stemming from their personal charisma. This is what we call charismatic legitimacy. They looked glorious, they acted refined, they made for fine symbols of the people who cheered them on in the square. All this ultimately made no real difference, though. With enough supporters, even the boorish despots basked in their traditional roles and faced relatively little resistance. And so they relied on traditional legitimacy and then coercion as well. Now, such royalty had very little in terms of domestic expenditures when you go back, way back when. Educational systems, healthcare, all that kind of stuff. They didn't. Instead, they spent their treasure on expanding the state. And soon enough, you had royal empires, mostly but not exclusively European, and they covered most of the world. Eventually, though, imperial rule lost its shine among those who once appreciated it or respected it or simply accepted it. You had the overexpansion. That was probably the biggest problem. And the first large cracks in the whole imperial paradigm really appeared with the rise of nationalism in the 19th century. Once ethnic groups began to adopt their own political aspirations, the inherently multi-ethnic empires that were inherently non-democratic were on the out. The revolutions of 1848 epitomized this movement. People were motivated by nationalism and a desire to rule themselves, self-determination. But also everything from liberalism to communism to anarchy. There were lots of political ideologies that were out there. And most of these were also quickly defeated, these 1848 revolutions. But they added to the popular conceptions that people should have some sort of say in their own governance. And so this brings us to the waves of democracy. The first wave of democratization had already begun after the French Revolution of 1789. But really up until 1830, a majority of the democratic movements were simultaneously independence movements. And they were primarily based in Latin America. The U.S. democracy movement was also an independence movement. Again, democracy as freedom, the right to self-rule, freedom from the empire. By the early 1900s, this wave was spreading in Europe. Russia's 1905 pro-constitutional revolt was one sign of this. And Russia's revolt was actually mimicked in other countries, as far off as Iran and China, that within a couple of years had their own pro-constitutional revolts. A much more important catalyst, though, was World War I, which led to the implosion of these various empires in Europe. The Russian Empire, where democracy had proved very short-lived, and they had gone quickly back to a Tsarism, which never really went away, but also the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. And this was the crest of the very long first wave of democratization. From 1918 to 1921, you have countries from Georgia and Armenia in the south, to Poland, Estonia, and Finland in the north, that went from imperial monarchies to these nascent democracies. Again, from the beginning of this, I talked about U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, who promised democracy, he promised self-determination, and the war-ravaged Europeans embraced it. So popular notions of self-determination at the time were based on the notion that human rights in the imperial status quo would never be adequately protected. If self-determination meant democracy, then democracy sounded great, because that's what people wanted. And the first wave of democratization peaked thanks to this. Now the big problem in the period after World War I was that democracy was built on still shifting tectonic plates. These new proto-democracies lacked a solid commitment to a concept that was still competing with other ideologies for prominence. No one said on the international stage that democracy is the only legitimate system. There was no world body preaching democracy from above. The only world body that existed after World War I was the League of Nations, this first try at a world community, which not only lacked strength, but it was also much more about international security than it was about democracy. And at the time, democracy was certainly in no way connected to security. There was no idea that a world of democracies will be safer. Woodrow Wilson was talking about making the world safe for democracy, not making democracies to make the world safe. From below also, democracy quickly proved to be a failure. It couldn't provide what people expected. People expected prosperity, and democracy wasn't delivering this. Remember, this is the period of the global depression. Some people waited a year or two, others gave it more than a decade, but a majority of new democracies, these constitutional governments, ultimately gave way to other rival systems that promised to do a better job than the messy democracies that had been given a shot. So between 1922 and 1942, the number of democracies plummeted from 29 to just 12, representing only 1/5 of all the countries in the world. Communism and fascism sometimes took its place. A second wave of democratization began after World War II, and it followed the pattern set before, where self-determination and an end to colonialism meant democracy. If democracy and self-determination were a tandem in 1918, they were even closer in 1945. This was the period when vanquished, fatigued, or morally distraught European and Asian powers surrendered their worldly possessions. They gave up. And those who took on these worldly possessions, in other words, these independence movements, took on democratic templates as well. So this is the second wave of democratization after World War II, going up to the 1970s. What was different now was that there was now an international center, the United Nations. That was the obvious place to go if you wanted at least nominal sovereignty, if you didn't want to be taken over quickly after gaining independence. Once the other officially recognized states declared you a member of the club, it became much more difficult and much more costly for others to deny you your statehood. So you wanted to be a member quickly. Membership in the UN nearly doubled to 99 in the first 15 years after World War II. And then it climbed to 144 in the next 15 years, from 1960 to 1975, as decolonization picked up pace. And today there are nearly 200 independent member states. Which brings us to the role of the UN. And I'll take that in a separate set of slides.